The year broke slowly over England as though the land itself hesitated to wake. In the pale dawn of the 19th century, mist lay heavy upon fields once rich with certainty, and the old order lingered like breath on cold glass. War had reshaped men and fortunes alike, yet the rituals of the aristocracy endured with stubborn grace. Balls were still held beneath chandeliers, titles were still spoken with reverence, and daughters were still bartered in drawing rooms where smiles concealed quiet dread. It was an age that prized decorum above truth and endurance above happiness, and nowhere did that tension breathe more keenly than in the crumbling estate of Alderwick Hall. The house had stood for generations, its stone walls bearing witness to triumphs long past, but time had thinned its grandeur. The roof leaked in winter storms, the gardens bloomed unevenly, and servants now moved with careful economy rather than pride. Yet within its fading rooms lived the last unmarried daughter of a baronet whose name still commanded respect, if not solvency. She had been raised to speak softly, walk gracefully, and accept her fate with composure. Society had taught her that beauty was currency, obedience was virtue, and silence was strength. She had learned these lessons well, though none had settled comfortably in her heart. From childhood she had occupied the edges of every room. While her sisters shone briefly and were swiftly married, she remained, praised for her manners but rarely admired. No one called her plain aloud, yet the absence of compliments spoke clearly enough. Still, she possessed an observant mind and a spirit that refused to dull, even as circumstances conspired to reduce her to a solution rather than a person. She read when she could, listened more than she spoke, and learned to recognize the subtle shifts in tone that preceded difficult truths. It was this quiet perception that first warned her of what was coming. The letter arrived sealed in heavy wax, its message wrapped in courtesy but weighted with finality. A match had been arranged with an earl whose lands promised stability and whose years promised little tenderness. He was not cruel, so far as anyone knew, but he was weary, accustomed to obedience, and in want of an heir more than companionship. To her father the proposal represented rescue. To society it was sensible. To her it felt like a slow erasure. She did not protest at once. Women of her station were not raised to resist such decisions, and she understood the peril her refusal might invite. Yet beneath her calm exterior, resolve began to take shape. It was not love that held her back, for her heart was not entangled elsewhere, nor had she entertained foolish dreams of romance. What unsettled her was the certainty that once bound, she would be rendered invisible even to herself. Marriage to the Earl would secure her family's future at the cost of her own inner life, and that exchange, so common as to be unremarkable, struck her as a quiet kind of ruin. She began to imagine a different ending, though she scarcely dared give it form. Beyond Alderwick Hall, the world shifted in small but significant ways. Veterans returned from foreign fields bearing scars both seen and hidden, and among them was the Duke of Harland. He came home with measured steps and uncelebrated victories, his reputation forged in discipline rather than display. Tall, reserved, and keenly aware of his position, he moved through society with a gravity that discouraged frivolity. He spoke little of the war, yet its imprint followed him into every room, lending his presence a solemn weight. Their acquaintance had begun years earlier in moments too brief to invite scandal. A conversation overheard in a library, a shared glance during a tiresome recital, a mutual understanding that neither acknowledged aloud. He had noticed her long before others thought to look, drawn not by beauty alone but by the intelligence that flickered behind her restraint. Yet he had never pursued her, bound by an honor that governed his every decision. She was beneath him in rank, promised to another in expectation, and he himself was weary of want. Desire, he believed, must be mastered, not indulged. When word of her impending betrothal reached him, he felt no shock, only a tightening resolve to accept what was inevitable. Still, he watched her more closely then, sensing the quiet tension she carried like a held breath. He recognized the difference between compliance and consent, between silence and peace. Though he offered no counsel, his attention lingered, a steady presence she felt even when she did not see him. As preparations for the engagement moved forward, the house grew heavier with expectation. Visitors arrived to offer congratulations not yet earned, and each polite inquiry pressed further upon her composure. She performed her role with practiced grace, yet each evening found her more resolved. She began to plan in secret, not with recklessness but with care. She would leave before the contract was signed, before duty could bind her irrevocably. Where she would go remained uncertain, but uncertainty felt preferable to surrender. The night before her intended departure, she stood at her window and looked out over the grounds, silvered by moonlight and memory. This place had shaped her, but it would not define her end. She packed only what she could carry, choosing utility over sentiment, and rose before dawn while the household slept. The air was cold and wet with mist as she stepped beyond the familiar threshold, heart steady despite the enormity of her choice. She had nearly reached the wrought iron gate when the sound reached her, unmistakable even through the fog. Hooves, measured and deliberate, approaching along the drive. She stopped, breath caught between fear and recognition, as a rider emerged from the pale gray. It was the Duke of Harland, reins held loosely, his posture composed yet intent. He did not look surprised to see her, nor did he dismount at once. Instead, he regarded her with an expression that held neither judgment nor command, only understanding. In that moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them, filled with all that had gone unspoken. He had come not to prevent her, but to witness her choice, and in his presence she felt, for the first time, entirely seen. The path ahead remained uncertain, yet something had shifted irrevocably. As dawn broke faintly over the land, she understood that escape was no longer merely flight, but the beginning of reckoning, one that would demand courage from them both. The mist clung stubbornly to the ground as though unwilling to release what it had witnessed, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The Duke remained mounted, not as a figure of authority, but as a man who understood the delicacy of the instant. She stood with her small traveling bag at her feet, the weight of it less burdensome than the decision that had carried her here. In the hush between night and morning, England felt suspended, balanced between what had always been and what might soon unravel. He was the first to move, guiding his horse a step closer before dismounting with deliberate care. There was no haste in him, no trace of triumph, only restraint honed by years of discipline. When he faced her fully, she saw in his expression something steadier than concern, a recognition of resolve answering resolve. He inclined his head in greeting, the gesture formal yet intimate, as though honoring not her rank but her courage. "I hoped I might find you," he said quietly, his voice low enough to preserve the privacy of the moment. He did not ask why she was leaving, nor did he attempt to dissuade her. The absence of interrogation struck her more sharply than any plea might have done. She answered him with a nod, uncertain how to frame what she felt without exposing too much of herself. "I could not remain," she replied at last, choosing honesty over eloquence. "Nor could I explain myself in ways that would be understood." He accepted this without challenge, his gaze never wavering. "Understanding is often withheld from those who most deserve it," he said, not as consolation but as fact. The war had taught him the limits of persuasion, and he had learned that some truths must be lived rather than defended. They stood together as the sky lightened almost imperceptibly, the world awakening around them in indifferent rhythm. She realized then that he had known of her intention before she herself had fully committed to it. His presence was not coincidence, but choice, and that knowledge stirred something within her that bordered on gratitude and fear in equal measure. "I did not come to stop you," he continued, as though reading the question in her eyes, "nor to offer protection that would bind you to another obligation." His words were measured, each one weighed before release. "I came because you should not pass this threshold unseen." At that, her composure wavered. All her life she had been observed only in relation to what others required of her, her worth measured in alliances and appearances. To be acknowledged simply as herself, standing on the brink of an uncertain future, felt dangerously close to freedom. She steadied herself, unwilling to let emotion cloud her judgment. "I do not know where I am going," she admitted. "Only that I cannot go where I am meant to be sent." "That is knowledge enough," he answered. "Most never reach even that." Silence followed, not empty, but filled with all that propriety forbade them to speak. He did not offer his hand, nor did he step closer than courtesy allowed. His restraint was not born of indifference, but of respect so profound it bordered on reverence. In that restraint, she sensed the depth of feeling he had long concealed, and its quiet constancy unsettled her more than any grand declaration could have done. She looked back toward the house, its outline dim against the thinning fog. Every window held a memory, every stone a reminder of duty impressed upon her since childhood. Leaving it behind felt like betrayal, yet remaining would have been a betrayal of herself. She turned back to him, searching his face for guidance she knew he would not presume to give. "What would you have me do?" she asked softly, not as a plea but as an invitation to truth. He met her gaze steadily. "I would have you choose," he said. "Freely and without expectation of reward." After a pause, he added, "including any expectation of me." The honesty of that answer anchored her. She had feared that his presence implied an alternative path already laid before her, another role waiting to be assumed. Instead, he offered her the rarest gift of all, the right to decide without coercion, even from affection. She drew a slow breath, considering the weight of what lay ahead. "If I leave now," she said, "I become a subject of speculation, perhaps of censure. My family will suffer for it." "Yes," he replied. "They may." "And if I return," she continued, "I will be bound to a life I cannot endure." He did not hesitate. "That, I believe, would be the greater loss." The certainty in his voice surprised her, not because it was forceful, but because it was so calmly assured. He spoke not as a man defending his desire, but as one acknowledging a truth he could not deny. In that instant, she understood that his devotion was not a sudden impulse sparked by her rebellion, but something older, forged in observation and restraint, tempered by time. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of clarity unmarred by fear. When she opened them again, her decision had shifted, not away from courage but toward a deeper reckoning. Flight, she realized, might spare her from immediate sacrifice, but it would also remove her from the field where her choice could hold meaning. To leave without confronting what she rejected would grant the world permission to define her absence as weakness. "I will go back," she said at last, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Not to accept what has been decided, but to refuse it openly." He studied her with renewed respect as though seeing her anew. "That path will be more difficult," he said. "I know," she answered. "But it will be mine." For the first time, a faint smile touched his expression, restrained yet unmistakable. "Then you will not walk it unseen," he replied. He did not offer to accompany her back to the house, nor did she ask it of him. Some boundaries once honored must remain intact. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing her to pass through the gate she had so nearly crossed. As she turned toward home, she felt the weight of her choice settle into resolve rather than doubt. Behind her, he mounted his horse once more, watching as she walked steadily toward the life she intended to challenge rather than escape. The distance between them widened, yet the understanding forged in that quiet dawn endured. Neither knew what consequences would follow, only that the course of their lives had shifted in ways that could not be undone. By the time the sun rose fully over Alderwick Hall, she had returned to her chamber, her bag unpacked, her expression composed. To any observer nothing had changed. Yet beneath that calm surface, a transformation had taken root. She was no longer merely the subject of arrangement, but a woman prepared to confront the terms of her existence. Elsewhere, the Duke rode on through the brightening countryside, his thoughts fixed not on the war he had survived, but on the courage he had just witnessed. Honor, he knew, was not proven only on battlefields, but in the choices made when no witness could confer glory. As preparations began for the approaching London season, and with it the ball that would gather all expectations under one glittering roof, both understood that what awaited them would demand even greater resolve. The reckoning had begun, and England, poised on the edge of change, would soon bear witness. The ballroom glowed as though determined to deny the uncertainty of the age, every candle burning with extravagant insistence. Light spilled from crystal chandeliers onto silk and polished marble, illuminating a gathering that believed itself eternal. Titles were announced with practiced reverence, fans fluttered in coded conversation, and music rose in graceful defiance of the world beyond the windows. This was society at its most self-assured, a place where reputations were shaped not by truth, but by what could be witnessed under gilded ceilings. She arrived without announcement beyond her name, dressed with elegant restraint rather than display. Her gown was chosen not to command attention, but to reflect composure, a quiet confidence that surprised those who had once overlooked her. Whispers followed her progress across the room, not of admiration exactly but of curiosity. News of her broken betrothal had traveled swiftly, softened by conjecture and sharpened by judgment. Some saw her as reckless, others as pitiable, but none suspected how deliberately she now occupied her place among them. She did not seek the center of the room, nor did she retreat entirely to its edges. Instead, she stood where she could observe without hiding, her posture composed, her expression serene. The Wallflower had learned to root herself firmly, refusing to fade into decoration. Each breath steadied her, reminding her that she had chosen this moment, that she stood here by will rather than obligation. The Duke of Harlan had not yet arrived, though his absence was remarked upon with interest. His return to society after years of restraint had been the subject of speculation long before this evening, and anticipation sharpened as the music paused between sets. When at last his name was announced, the room shifted almost imperceptibly, attention drawn as though by instinct rather than intent. He entered with measured calm, his bearing unchanged by the curious glances cast his way. He wore neither ostentation nor apology, his presence marked by the same controlled gravity that had defined him since his return from war. He acknowledged greetings with polite inclination, yet his gaze moved steadily through the room, searching not for approval, but for one particular figure. Before that search could end, another arrival claimed the room's immediate interest. She entered on the arm of a titled gentleman, her beauty undeniable, her confidence sharpened by familiarity with attention. Conversation stilled briefly, then resumed in lower tones, speculation threading swiftly through the crowd. She was known, not formally introduced, her association with the Duke long rumored and now seemingly confirmed. The word mistress was never spoken aloud, yet it hovered unmistakably in the air. She carried herself with practiced ease, her smile precise, her presence calculated to provoke notice. To many, she embodied the indulgences permitted to men of rank, the quiet hypocrisy society tolerated so long as they remained discreet. Her appearance tonight was not accidental. It was a declaration, and it landed exactly as intended. Across the room, the heroine observed the subtle shift, the way eyes flicked between the Duke and the woman presumed to claim him. For a moment, old instinct urged retreat, the familiar urge to diminish herself in the face of more commanding presence. She resisted it, grounding herself in the memory of dawn mist and iron gates, of a choice reclaimed rather than abandoned. The Duke's attention had already fixed upon her, though he had yet to move. In that instant, all speculation dissolved into irrelevance. The woman who had defied expectation stood unbowed, and he recognized the courage that had carried her here. He felt no confusion, no hesitation, only clarity sharpened by consequence. He began to cross the room. The shift was immediate and electric. Conversations faltered as guests sensed movement that did not align with expectation. He passed those who sought his notice without pause, his focus unwavering. He walked past the woman at his side in rumor, her smile tightening as realization dawned. For the first time that evening, uncertainty crossed her expression, the confident script disrupted. He did not look at her as he passed. He did not offer explanation or dismissal. Instead, he continued forward, each step deliberate, until he reached the woman standing alone yet unhidden, the one who had chosen visibility over safety. The distance between them closed, and the room seemed to draw a collective breath. Then, before astonishment could turn to comprehension, he knelt. The gesture was unmistakable, irreverent to convention yet precise in intention. He lowered himself not in secrecy, but in full view of society's judgment, one knee touching the marble floor that had borne generations of calculated alliances. Murmurs rippled outward, disbelief threading swiftly through the assembly. A duke did not kneel lightly nor without cause. He looked up at her, his expression unguarded at last. "I would ask your leave," he said clearly, his voice carrying beyond their immediate circle, "to offer what should have been spoken long ago." Her breath caught, though she did not step back. She met his gaze steadily, aware of every eye upon them, yet anchored by the honesty she saw reflected there. This was not spectacle for its own sake, but reckoning made visible. "I will not pretend," he continued, "that I have been free of error, nor that my name has been untroubled by rumor. But I will state plainly that my honor belongs where my respect has long resided." His voice did not waver. "With you." The room seemed suspended between outrage and awe. No precedent offered guidance for this moment, no script dictated response. The woman who had been presumed his mistress stood frozen, the truth of her position exposed without a single word directed her way. Society's assumptions collapsed under the weight of quiet declaration. She felt the enormity of the moment press upon her, yet alongside it rose a steadiness born of hard-won self-knowledge. This was not rescue nor redemption bestowed from above. It was recognition offered openly without guarantee of acceptance. "Rise," she said softly, though the word carried further than she expected. "Not because I refuse you, but because I will not have you kneel as though I stand above you." A murmur swept the room again, this time tinged with something like wonder. He rose at once, relief and admiration mingling in his expression. They stood facing one another as equals, the symmetry of their posture a quiet rebuke to every assumption that had sought to define them separately. What followed was not immediate resolution, but a beginning publicly acknowledged. Whispers would multiply, consequences would unfold, and judgment would not soften overnight. Yet something irrevocable had occurred. A line had been crossed not in scandal but in truth. As the music resumed with hesitant grace, conversation gradually returned, altered yet persistent. The couple did not dance immediately. They stood together for a moment longer, allowing the weight of what had passed to settle. Neither spoke, for words would have diminished what had already been declared. Beyond the ballroom, the age continued its slow turning, resistant yet vulnerable to change. Titles would endure, fortunes would rise and fall, but the quiet courage displayed beneath the chandeliers that night would echo in subtler ways. A woman once overlooked had claimed her visibility, and a man bound by honor had chosen transparency over convenience. As they moved together toward the edge of the room, not retreating but repositioning, the future remained unwritten. England stood poised between tradition and transformation, and within that tension, their story had found its voice. The ball would be remembered not for its splendor, but for the moment when decorum yielded and history, however briefly, knelt to truth.